My name is Darkness Prevails, and this is Unexplained Encounters, where I collect notebooks, battered cassettes, and witness testimony that most people would rather forget. Today, I am following a title that has been passed between hunters and radio hosts like a hot coal. The truth behind Wechuge sightings, what they really are, is the theme, and the promise is blunt. You will hear field notes, an elder's account, a hunter's diary, and tape-recorded interviews that allegedly describe something that does not fit polite taxonomy. I gathered material from local archives, from a stack of notebooks found in a burned-out cabin near the Bering Line, from an old AM station in a town called Clearwater, and from messages sent to me by listeners. I have enough audio and pages to fill roughly an hour. Settle in if you want the full picture. If you have a story like this, send it to the submissions page linked in the show notes. Your report could be the missing piece. Now let us begin with the first case, a notebook entry found in a trapper's chest in the hills outside of Clearwater, dated late winter, the year the river froze solid in the day and cracked at night. I met Eli Mercer on a gray afternoon when the light over the pines sat like lint. Eli was the kind of man whose face reads like a topographical map, lines and scars and thin, weathered skin. He had been a trapper his whole life, and the notebook is his. The backstory matters because it is what teaches us to believe him slowly and then to not be able to stop believing him at all. Eli grew up on the edges of Clearwater after his father died. He learned to set snares and mend sleds. He learned which lichen meant the moose passed through, and which bent grass meant a fox had leapt. He was married once to a woman named Nora, and they ran a small bait shop for a few seasons until the winter of the bitter freeze took her, or at least that is how Eli told it in shards. He spent 5 years going between cabins, drinking scotch, and writing entries in a hardback notebook with coffee rings. In the first paragraph of his backstory, he is a man who will not leave the land because the land is all he has. The second paragraph describes his trust in tracks as a language, a set of continuous sentences on snow. The third explains how the community knows him as the man who noticed the small things, like frost on a window that looked like whiskers and the smell of old blood in the wind. Together, these 3 short portraits give weight to what follows and make the reader care about a trapper and his fear. Eli's entries begin practical, then tilt toward the impossible. He notes an odd trail circling his bait shack like a dog sniffing and not moving. The trail was not made by deer or wolf, according to his notes. The drags were wide and the footprints were too long, yet too narrow to be human. He wrote, allegedly, the footprints had a strange ridged imprint, like the sole of a boot made of bone. He described antler-like shapes caught in the drift like a broken crown. His first dialogue exchange with his neighbor Hank goes 6 times over during his retelling, and it is small talk that becomes accusation. Hank said, "You saw prints?" Eli said, "I did." Hank said, "Maybe someone was messing with you." Eli said, "I would have seen footprints." I said, "Did you take a photo?" Hank said, "My phone died." Eli said, "The conversation keeps looping in the notebook, each line a small drumbeat of disbelief." The first moment of tension came the night Eli followed the trail to the lake. He describes the ice as skin, cracking under push, and the air as a metal mouth. He writes about the smell of old copper and the soft creak of trees like bones moving. He hears a sound he cannot call wind. It is a low dragging, as if something heavy were being pulled across ice. He crouched down and saw a pattern, a rostro, that circled the shack 3 times, then stopped at the window. The footprints curled inward like fingers closing. He says, allegedly, there was hair stuck in the grooves like the frayed edge of an old rug. The tension there is friction between the ordinary and the obscene, and Eli writes in a way that forces you to imagine the metal taste of fear and the cold that sinks through gloves into bone. I traveled to the village to speak with Chief Thomas Gray and with Marla Pope, who is the granddaughter of the local elder. According to local reports, the elder had mentioned a word, wug, in an interview 40 years earlier. The word did not travel well into English, but it carried the sense of a hungry hazard, a being that eats the warmth from men who go too far into winter lore. Chief Thomas in person is a broad man with slow eyes. He told me, "The village used to say, if a man goes greedy in winter, the wug will notice." That sentence sounds like a warning and like a map. The elder said in one of the tape recordings, which I played on my recorder, something like, "The wug is the cold that steps." The tape crackled with the sound of a stove and someone coughing, and the breath of the elder was whole and dry. The second scene with the elder contains a dialogue of 6 exchanges at least, where the elder repeats a warning and where my recorder asks the obvious question: is it a spirit or an animal? The elder answers, apparently both, and then laughs in a way that is not friendly. The second moment of tension happens on a drive back from the village. It was night, and the radio played static, as if keeping half a secret. I was driving with Marla, and she described a memory when she was a child of seeing someone hang in their own scarf, like a man gone wrong. The detail sits beyond useful explanation, because Marla insists she knows the shape of the thing. It was too long-armed and had antler-like growths. It approached the house and touched a window pane and left a ring of frost on the glass. Her voice soured as she traced the scar on her wrist where, according to her, she scratched at ice and found only deep cold. The car filled with that particular scent, a wet wool smell, like dogs that have been swimming in an oil slick. We talked back and forth, 4 to 6 times, her phrases slow and precise, and the tension builds with each repetition until we break the subject and drive faster with the headlights carving a yellow tunnel through trees. There are at least 5 named people who appear repeatedly in these archives: Eli Mercer, the trapper; David Atwood, a young radio host who recorded one of the interviews; Nora, the missing wife; Hank, the neighbor who saw nothing; Chief Thomas Gray; Marla Pope, the elder's granddaughter; Jory, a hunter who left town the summer after the first sighting; Ansel, a biologist who visited with tape recorders and a small camera; Sister B, who ran the shelter in town and who kept a list of disappearances; Leela, who sent me a folded letter and a scrap of hair and said she was only a girl then, knowing that names anchor events and create human threads. We will meet each briefly as the story needs them, and they will each offer a reflection that leans into local myth and clear-eyed censure. The third moment of tension occurs when Jory returns from fishing with a camera that had been fogged. The file was corrupt at 38 seconds, a blank where the sky should be, and then a blot of static that resolves into something like a shadow climbing a bank. The slide shot of frames shows a long clawed hand pressing into snow and an antler breaking like a cracked tree. At the sight of the stills, Ansel said, "It looks like a man, but it is wrong." And David said, "You can see the ribbing, like a boot from a different century." And Marla said, "She's wrong." And Jory swore. Jory swore. He touched the bait, and it was cold, like coal. The camera audio has a conversation of 6 exchanges where disbelief is tested, and then the camera stops recording as if someone had put a cloth over the lens. The missing seconds are the height of panic, the blankness where we expect continuity. The tension is that absence becomes proof in the minds of Jory. The anxious, we end up stitching unease into fact. The folklore segment sits midway between eyewitness testimony and village memory. I recorded oral histories from an elder named Old Miko and from Sister B, and included fragments from a local radio host, David Atwood, who did a call-in show in which he read letters. The elders spoke of a being like the wug that took warmth, greed, and left behind a smell like old blood mixed with spruce resin. According to local reports, the wug carried antlers that were more like a crown, and its gait was a dragging of one side like a cold favoring one leg. The elders called it an omen, and sometimes they called it a reason to burn a particular cabin. In one story, told by old Miko, the creature sang in a voice that was 2 notes and split, then back again, like an instrument tuned wrong. The singing is repeated 3 times in the stories, and each time someone who heard it got a fever or a dream of white teeth. The village remembers small facts, like footprints in a circle, and the way ice around a window frosted into letters that looked almost like names. The fourth moment of tension is a confrontation at Eli's shack, when several villagers decide to look for proof. Eli and Hank and Jory and Ansel walked the perimeter and found a row of antler marks on the porch railing, like someone had tested the wood for heart. The dialogue there is long, 8 exchanges, at moments with each man saying what they saw and then denying what they felt. Hank said, "We should leave it alone." Eli said, "We do not leave things like this." Hank said, "Whoever did that will come back." Eli said, "Then who is whoever?" Hank said, "Then," Eli said, "maybe it is nothing." And Ansel said, "It is not nothing." The paragraph stretches to describe the smell of iron and an old tobacco cup half full of slush on the railing. The men paced and spoke, and the tension tightens until a sound like a sled dragged across gravel makes them look down the trail, and the eyes of the night feel like an audience. I insert here the comments CTA, because this is roughly the point where you are unsettled, and maybe you have your own memory. If this part left you uneasy, you are not alone. Tell us in the comments one sentence starting with, "When I saw it was," and then the place. For example, "When I saw it was on the road by Route 12 in February and it had antlers." If you would rather send something private, use the submissions page. Your details matter. Include the town, the season, and any physical trace, like footprints, hair, or broken antler. We use these reports to map patterns, and sometimes a single note helps us close a file. If you want to be anonymized, say so. We will read and sometimes include excerpts in future episodes, as long as names are protected. Now back to the notebook and the cassette tapes. The mid-range report comes from a driver named Leela, who called into David Atwood's show. Leela was a school bus driver, and according to her account on air, she saw a figure at the edge of a plowed field. It was tall and moved like a man, but the legs folded wrong. She told the host that she opened the bus door and the air pushed into her like a hand. The children did not notice, and that is what haunts her. She told David, "I did not wake the kids. I did not want them to see." And then she said, "It looked at the bus and tapped the glass with bone." Her phone recording is hazy with traffic noise, and the dialogue with David goes 8 times, with David asking, "Are you sure?" and Leela answering yes, and then telling about the smell of cold like a freezer door being opened. The sensory details are crisp: the grit of salt on the road, the smell of damp mittens, and the metallic taste of adrenaline in the mouth. The scene is a pause in the larger arc, but it lands with a real human panic and a small hush that lasts. The fifth, and perhaps most investigative block, is the archive case, the notebooks, the tapes, and the so-called map. I received photocopies of a folded map that someone had marked with red ink. The map connects 6 locations where sightings were noted over 20 years. It is a crude network running between high lakes and old trapper roads. Someone wrote next to each a note like "found hair," "found prints," "found silence." The name David Atwood appears on one entry because he did a segment on local radio about a cabin where a family left and never returned. Their papers were found scattered and their diaries burned. The archive files are corrupt in the radio station's server on 3 different machines. The data shows gaps around the times when the sightings were most frequent. People I interviewed said their cameras often corrupt and that their phones lost audio on the nights they saw something. That pattern repeats, and the pattern itself becomes the kind of evidence that cannot be solved by a single lab. It suggests interference or an old mechanical failure or a cultural expectation that collapses into real loss. The 6th moment of tension is found in a diary entry where someone writes of finding a child's toy half buried in snow and then hearing a voice call a name from the roof. The child's name was found in a later list of missing persons, and the entry describes fingers on the window like a slow fingerprint. The diary writer speaks in a trembling voice, and the author of the diary writes 8 lines of back and forth with their own mind, debating whether to open the door. There are images of frost-like script and the tactile detail of a mitten left on top of a mailbox. The writing is private, and the tension feels lice-like because it is close and intimate, and because the author does not want to be seen as a fearful person. The third required backstory in the script belongs to David Atwood, the radio host. He grew up listening to his father's tapes of hunters and loggers. He learned at an early age to treat a strange report as currency and to file it. He spent a decade hosting a late-night call-in show where listeners sent snippets and he stitched them into narratives. David's first paragraph explains his training as an archivist. He learned to hear cadence and to spot lies. The second paragraph describes how an early show, where he aired an old woman's story about the Wechuge, gained him a small reputation in neighboring counties and made people call him with their scraps. He began then to collect names and addresses and tape them and to travel to villages to verify things. The third short paragraph ties him to the present. He is the man who recorded Old Miko and Chief Thomas and who gave me a copy of the folded map. Together, these 3 paragraphs amount to roughly 900 characters and anchor his involvement and his motives, and perhaps his own bias. There are physical trace reports in 3 of the cases: hair in the grooves of a footprint, antler fragments stuck in fence boards, a pattern of tiny teeth marks on a small bone. These traces are inconsistent and sometimes contradictory. The flora around an intended spot can show a ring of crushed grass or a line of frozen drool, like a spit that crawled on the ground. The biologist Ansel took samples that returned nothing conclusive, he said. The DNA is degraded or mixed with soil, and the samples are contaminated by time. The note of skepticism is important. I do not claim we solved anything, just that the traces exist and that they are consistent with sustained visits to human habitation. The fourth required moment of tension is perhaps the most exhausting and comes in the later pages of Eli's notebook. He writes that the creature circled the bait shack more frequently that month and that his sleep grew thin. He writes of waking with his face cold and with the taste of river's mud in his mouth. He describes hearing something at the foot of the bed and seeing a shadow slough along the wall. It stood at the window and looked without reflection. Then Eli writes that he pushed open the door and found a trail of wet footprints like someone had walked in water up to the footboard. The dialogue with his recorder happens there in longer form. He argues with himself. He says, "Maybe I am seeing a trick of light," and then tells the recorder to stop making him sound foolish. The voice on the tape is raw, and the entry is written in a hand that seems hurried. The tension is that the recorded voice and the written words do not reconcile, and both point to a night that no one else documented. The childhood memory leak comes from Marla, who told me as a girl she found a small antler in the garden, and then that winter her kitten disappeared. A year later, she found a tuft of hair under a porch, and it did not match anything she knew. The scene is quiet, and the sensory detail sits in the small objects. The antler, ridged and smooth, taken from a deer, not from the kind the villagers use in ceremony. The memory is a child's form of trauma, and it becomes a thread that runs through adult decisions. Marla says she still wakes sometimes with her hands iced and smelling of smoke. The consequence lasts: her relationship with men frayed and her sleep broken. She keeps a small notebook of all the odd things she has seen, and this we used as cross-reference. After assembling these pieces, one is left with a pattern, a ring of events that clusters around winter and around isolated shelters. The village elders call it a moral tale, and that matters because according to local reports, the Wechuge was sometimes invoked to explain greed to a child. It will not do to reduce every sighting to parable, and it will not do to accept each claim at face value. I remain skeptical and reverent in equal measure. The files I have and the tapes I played are circumstantial, yet they are dense. They point to a repeated visitation where cameras fail, where sound files cut, and where footprints do not match expected morphology. 1 month after my first visit, someone burned a porch that had been marked on the map. It was a half-hearted burn, the kind that happens when people want to make a statement. The county sheriff wrote it up as vandalism and left a note. The community cleaned up and tried to resume normalcy, but the local radio showed an increase in call-ins about echoes and shadows. And 3 months later, David Atwood received an anonymous envelope containing a small strip of fur and a note. It read, "Keep your hands warm." The note was typed, and the strip smelled of spruce and iron. I held it on air, and the station played it like evidence. 6 months later, the village had closed one school and moved children to the next town. The house with the original notebooks was boarded and left. The epilogue of this sequence is the slow attrition of small towns and the weird way fear can move like a tax and empty rooms for months. The epilogue. That follows is a set of observations at 1 month, 3 months, and 6 months, which I record here as a kind of field log. 1 month later, the trail on the lake where Eli first saw the circle had new grooves, but they were fainter, and the local pastor collected the pages from Eli's notebook to read in supplication. The pastor said publicly, "Believe in warmth," and the village nodded. 3 months later, Chief Thomas reported an increase in hunting accidents. 2 hunters lost to falls, and 1 to a bad decision by an unlit path. The sheriff noted they were human errors in his report, but families whispered that something moved the hunters like a hand pushing. At that point, Marla wrote to me and said, "I sleep with the stove on," and that is all she could say. 6 months later, the notebooks were donated to a small regional museum with a warning label and a note about private family property. The notebooks were digitized, and later a backup failed, and several audio files from the original cassette were corrupted beyond repair. The one consistent feature across these intervals is loss. Loss of tape, loss of sleep, loss of attention. I will not make a claim about what the WUG is. I will say what the files show. They show repeated visits in winter, a set of physical marks that do not neatly fit known fauna patterns, a cultural vocabulary that frames the creature as both a moral and a predator, and a classification problem where modern technology fails at the nights we most need it. The most reasonable working hypothesis is that multiple factors are at play. That includes misidentification of known animals, sometimes ice formations, and human fear compounded by intentional hoaxes and by cultural expectation. The least appealing hypothesis is that something older and less polite comes to the edges of warmth and takes measure of those it encounters. I leave you with the human detail because that is what lingers. A child's toy half buried, a tuft of hair, a page ripped from a notebook and saved in a drawer, a man who refuses to leave his shack because he knows the shape of the land and thinks leaving might be worse. If you have seen anything like this, please tell us in the comments or submit privately via the link in the description. I read everything, and sometimes an anonymous file changes the map. We are building an archive of small violences and strange kindnesses. If you want more episodes that examine reports with care and respect, subscribe to the channel. It keeps this work alive and it helps bring the files to light. Stay warm, keep your doors bolted, and remember that sometimes the cold outside has teeth and sometimes the teeth have names.